The soft glow of morning filtered through the tall glass windows of the airport terminal, casting long streaks of sunlight across the polished floor. Danielle Carter walked with purpose, her leather carry-on slung neatly over one shoulder, her passport tucked inside a navy blazer pocket. Her stride was calm, elegant, measured with the kind of grace that came from years of knowing exactly who she was and refusing to apologize for it. Her black heels tapped softly across the floor as she approached Gate 11, where the boarding sign for Flight 712 flashed, first class, now boarding. Danielle barely glanced at it. She didn't need to. She belonged here. Everything about her presence spoke of confidence. Her tailored slacks, the sleek silk blouse in deep wine red, her soft curls tucked back with gold pins, and the expression on her face, focused yet serene. She wasn't rushing or performing. She was simply existing, and that, somehow, always seemed to rattle people. As she stepped into the first-class line, she caught the faint shift of a glance from the woman ahead of her. It was so subtle it might have gone unnoticed. A slight stiffening of posture, a glance at Danielle's carry-on, then back to her face as if reevaluating what she was seeing. Danielle didn't react, but she felt it. She always felt it. When she reached the front of the line, the gate agent looked up, his smile pre-programmed. "Good morning," and he said, but as soon as his eyes met hers, something changed. It was brief, no more than a blink, but she caught it. His smile faltered for half a second, his gaze flicking down to the boarding pass in her hand, then up to her again, lingering as if silently asking, "Is this really yours?" Danielle handed him the pass with a calmness that had been sharpened by experience. She watched his eyes scan it, pause, then scan again. She knew this routine. It wasn't protocol, it was doubt, veiled in politeness. When he finally spoke, his tone had shifted, slightly more mechanical. Thank you, Miss Carter. You're in seat 2A. Enjoy your flight." She offered a polite nod and a quiet thank you before walking toward the jet bridge. She didn't roll her eyes. She didn't sigh. That kind of response, she had learned, only ever made her the problem. Instead, she let her silence speak, letting the moment settle on him, not her. As she entered the aircraft, the metallic scent of recirculated air and the low hum of engines filled the cabin. A flight attendant stood near the door, her uniform crisp, her posture stiff. "Welcome aboard," she said, but her voice held no warmth. Her eyes dropped quickly to Danielle's carry-on, then to her face again, her expression unreadable. She didn't offer assistance or a smile, just a barely there nod, then shifted her attention to the passenger boarding behind Danielle. Again, the moment was fleeting but not invisible. Danielle had walked into enough boardrooms, first-class cabins, and luxury lobbies to recognize the pattern. You don't fit what they expected, so you must be an anomaly, a mistake, something to be scrutinized. But Danielle had long stopped seeking comfort in their expectations. She moved forward without pause, gliding into the first-class cabin and placing her bag gently into the overhead bin. Her seat, 2A, faced the window, exactly what she'd requested. She slid into it, crossing her legs with ease, adjusting the cuff of her blouse, her movements fluid. From her peripheral vision, she noticed the woman across the aisle glance up from her magazine. Danielle turned her head slightly, catching her gaze. The woman looked away quickly, pretending to be absorbed in an article. Danielle leaned back against the headrest, staring out the window at the workers on the tarmac below. She didn't look angry. She wasn't. Not exactly. It was something else, something more exhausting. Because no one had said a slur. No one had told her she didn't belong. No one had denied her entry or called security. But they hadn't needed to. Their hesitation, their side glances, the subtle drop in tone, it was all part of the same unspoken question. What are you doing here? It was a question she had heard in different forms since she was a girl, sometimes from teachers, sometimes from shop owners, sometimes from people she passed on the sidewalk who clutched their purses just a little tighter. And now, as a successful executive flying internationally for a presentation she'd spent months preparing, it was still the question behind too many eyes. But Danielle had learned something far more powerful than fitting in: presence. She didn't shrink to make them comfortable. She didn't explain her worth to strangers. She carried herself like the storm they hoped she'd be afraid of, silent, steady, and too wide to stop. And that, more than anything, made them uneasy. So she sat in 2A, staring out the window at the sky, waiting for takeoff. And though no one applauded when she boarded, no one welcomed her like the others, and no one offered her the warm smile she'd seen them give the man in 2C, Danielle didn't falter. Because she wasn't there for them. She wasn't here to be approved of. She had earned her place, paid her fare, and brought with her a quiet force that couldn't be checked at the gate. Let them wonder. Let them stare. Danielle Carter had somewhere to be, and she wasn't asking for permission to fly. Danielle Carter sat quietly in her seat, 2A, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her gaze fixed on the clouds slowly rolling past the window. The early morning flight had just begun boarding, and already a strange stillness had settled around her. Not the calm stillness of routine air travel, but the kind of silence that grew in spaces where people chose not to see you. First class was filling up quickly, the sound of polite conversation and soft laughter floating through the cabin as passengers adjusted pillows and scrolled through emails. Flight attendants moved gracefully down the aisles with gleaming silver trays and confident, curated smiles, offering flutes of champagne and personalized greetings to those they passed. But somehow Danielle, poised, polished, and seated in plain view, was invisible. She watched as the woman in 2C was handed a mimosa with a delicate, "Enjoy your flight, ma'am," followed by a beaming grin. The man behind her in 3B received a firm handshake and a "We're so glad to have you aboard again, sir," accompanied by a knowing chuckle. It was hospitality at its finest. But when the same flight attendant, her name tag reading Lisa Cooper, glided past Danielle's seat, she didn't pause. No eye contact, no greeting, no offer of a beverage. Just a seamless pivot to the next row, as if seat 2A were occupied by a shadow. Danielle blinked once, exhaling slowly, the familiar chill of dismissal brushing across her skin like a draft through a cracked window. She gave it a moment. Perhaps it was an oversight. Surely it was just a mix-up. But minutes passed, and nothing changed. No tray, no offer, not even a glance. The hurt wasn't loud. It was quiet, subtle, but piercing all the same. This wasn't a new pain. Danielle knew it well. The ache of being left out of basic decency, the sting of being questioned without words, of existing in a space that was designed to welcome everyone, but never truly meant her. She glanced down at her pressed slacks, her navy blouse, her gold nameplate bracelet. Everything about her said she belonged here. But some people didn't see what was obvious. Some people refused to. Still, Danielle wasn't going to let it slide. She pressed the small silver call button on her armrest, the soft ding echoing above her. Within seconds, Lisa returned, her smile dimmer than the ones she'd flashed before. "Yes, ma'am?" she asked, her tone clipped, professional, but cold. Danielle lifted her chin slightly, her voice as smooth as it was firm. "Good morning. I noticed I didn't receive a pre-departure beverage. May I have some water, please?" There was a pause, just half a second too long, and Lisa's expression didn't change. She glanced down at Danielle's seat as if seeing her for the first time, then back up, her eyes unreadable. "We'll begin full service shortly," she said flatly. No apology, no offer to bring the water, and without another word she turned and walked away. Danielle blinked. The audacity of it was breathtaking. Not rude, dismissive, not loud, intentional. She sat back slowly in her seat, her heart steady but her chest tight. She wasn't embarrassed. No, not anymore. That had faded years ago. What she felt now was a rising, simmering awareness that this was more than an off moment. It was a pattern, one she'd seen in conference rooms and restaurants and airport lounges across her career. The selective smiles, the narrowed eyes, the subtle shift in tone that said, "You're not the kind of woman we expect here." And that's what made this hurt deeper. Because Danielle had worked twice as hard to sit in that seat. She'd earned it. She had climbed, fought, presented, led, endured, and still, even now, her presence in 2A came with a question mark in someone else's eyes. Across the aisle, a man sipped his sparkling wine and glanced at her curiously, his brow furrowed as if just now noticing the absence of a glass in her hand. He didn't say anything, but he noticed, and that was enough to remind her she wasn't imagining it. So she waited, not for water, but for the next moment. For the moment they would realize who they were ignoring, And now I want to speak directly to you, the one listening right now, the one who's followed Danielle's quiet strength through this quiet storm. Because this moment, it's not just about champagne or water. It's not about a glass tray or a flight attendant's attitude. It's about being seen. It's about the dignity we all deserve, not because of our seats or salaries, but because we're human. Danielle's story is not rare. It's yours. It's your mother's, your sister's, your friends. Or maybe it's you. And if you've ever sat in a seat you earned only to be made to feel like a stranger in it, if you've ever asked politely and been met with coldness, if you've ever carried yourself with grace, even when the world tried to make you small, then you know what this is. You've lived it. So let's not look away from it. Let's call it what it is. Let's stand with Danielle. Drop a comment below if her story resonated with you. Share this if you've ever had to sit silently through a moment that tried to erase you. Like this, if you believe everyone deserves respect, no matter what they look like, where they sit, or what others assume. Because this story isn't just about a flight. It's about the altitude of dignity, the turbulence of bias, and the strength it takes to soar above both. Stay with us. There's more to come. Because Danielle, she's not finished yet. And neither are we. Danielle Carter sat still in her seat, her posture composed, her face unreadable. But inside, she felt the layers of subtle disregard stacking higher with each passing moment. What began as an oversight had evolved into a deliberate pattern, a quiet strategy of exclusion playing out in plain sight. The other first-class passengers were now fully settled, exchanging warm banter with the flight attendants, clinking glasses, adjusting blankets that had been handed to them with care. Meanwhile, Danielle had not been offered a single courtesy. Her tray table was bare. Her request for water had been ignored. Her presence, though unmistakable, had been treated as inconvenient. And the more she noticed the details, the harder it became to dismiss the truth. This wasn't just neglect. It was intention. Her meal arrived later than everyone else's. She watched as the other passengers were greeted with cheerful tones. "Excellent choice. Let me know if you'd like another roll," while her tray was set down with a mechanical motion. The utensils barely aligned. The napkin twisted as if it had been tossed on without thought. Danielle didn't complain. She never did. She had learned long ago that for women like her, speaking up was often twisted into accusations of hostility. So she sat, unfolded the napkin herself, and adjusted her plate with quiet precision. The salmon was lukewarm, the salad unseasoned, and no bread roll accompanied the tray. But the absence of the roll wasn't the problem. The absence of dignity was. Still, the worst part came midway through the flight. She had risen to use the restroom, waiting respectfully for the occupied sign to turn off, and when it did, she stepped toward the door. But before she could reach for the handle, a woman seated in 1D, a white woman in a crisp blazer, interrupted her path. "Oh, I think the restroom in the back might be easier for Coach," the woman said, her tone smooth, casual, but pointed. Her voice was low enough to feign helpfulness, but loud enough that the passengers in the surrounding rows could hear. Danielle stopped in her tracks. For a moment, her breath caught in her throat. "Coach?" "I'm seated in 2A, Danielle replied, calmly but firmly. "This is my cabin." The woman blinked, her lips parting slightly. "Oh," she said, clearly caught off guard. I wasn't sure." Danielle offered no further explanation. She simply stepped past the woman and entered the restroom, locking the door gently behind her. Her hands gripped the small sink as she looked at her reflection in the mirror, her chest rising, slowly, steadily. She wasn't angry, not yet. She was exhausted, the kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from lack of sleep, but from being chipped at, bit by bit, until you feel like the space around you is made of glass walls you're not allowed to touch. When she returned to her seat, the atmosphere felt colder than before. Not because of the temperature, but because she could sense how many eyes had been on her. She sat down in silence, adjusting the hem of her blouse, her face serene. But inside, a quiet ache burned. As the flight continued, the disparities did too. While others were offered extra drinks, additional snacks, or soft conversation, Danielle was overlooked at every turn. She requested tea and waited 20 minutes before a young attendant, nervous, clearly junior, delivered it with a hand that trembled slightly. The cup was too full. No spoon, no sugar, no saucer. Danielle accepted it with grace, thanking the girl, even as the hot liquid sloshed against her fingers. And as she sipped the lukewarm tea, she began to feel something unexpected, not sadness, not even anger, but clarity. Because in all of these small, seemingly disconnected slights, a message was being delivered. A message that whispered, "You don't belong here." It was spoken in tone and omission, in subtle acts that were designed not to explode, but to erode. And Danielle knew she had a choice to make. Let the erosion continue or place a stone in the ground and mark her space with quiet, undeniable presence. She chose the latter. Her spine straightened, her chin lifted. And though she said nothing, her energy shifted. Unapologetic, unmoved. She pulled out her tablet and resumed reviewing her slides for the presentation that awaited her overseas. Her focus sharp, her elegance effortless. But this time, she was preparing for more than a business pitch. She was preparing quietly to make sure no one on this flight forgot what dignity looked like. And now, to you listening, yes, you, if you've ever felt the weight of being quietly excluded, if you've ever been the only one not offered kindness in a room full of smiles, if you've ever had to hold your breath and your peace just to make it through a moment without breaking, you are not alone. Danielle's story is not just hers. It's a reflection of what so many carry in silence. It's a reminder that injustice doesn't always come as a storm. Sometimes it arrives like a draft, cold, creeping, and constant. So if this story touched something in you, if you saw yourself in her poised stillness, her patient strength, her choice to rise anyway, drop a comment below. Write her name. Danielle, tell us how you've risen through subtle storms, like this video, to stand with the ones who've endured quiet battles in loud rooms. Because the fight for dignity doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's a whisper, and sometimes it sits in 2A, sipping tea with unshakable grace. Aisha Harris had remained silent for long enough. Not because she was unsure, not because she was afraid. No. She had waited because that's what she had been taught to do her entire life. To choose patience over confrontation. To give the benefit of the doubt even when her dignity was being slowly eroded by cold stares and clipped responses. She had let the glances slide, let the ignored requests settle on her shoulders like unwanted weight, allowed the slow drip of disrespect to go unchallenged. For a while. But everyone has a line, and when Lisa passed her seat again, offering a second glass of champagne to the man in 2C with a bright, performative smile and a warm, "Anything else for you, sir?" While never once acknowledging Aisha, again, something inside her shifted. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't stand up. What she did was far more powerful. She pressed the call button with purpose, her finger steady. The soft ding echoed in the air like a bell tolling for accountability. A few nearby passengers glanced up, curious. Lisa approached, her expression unreadable, her lips tight. "Yes, ma'am?" she asked, the word ma'am sounding like a placeholder for something else entirely. Aisha looked up, meeting her eyes without hesitation. Her voice was calm, clear. "Is there a reason," she began evenly, "that I've been consistently passed over for service since boarding?" Lisa blinked. The air around them thinned. "I'm sorry," Lisa replied, a touch too quickly. "I've watched you serve everyone else with warmth and attention," Aisha continued, her voice steady but growing firmer. "But when you come to me, your tone changes, your manner changes, or worse, you don't come at all." Lisa's composure cracked for a moment. "I assure you, ma'am, I'm treating all passengers equally." Aisha tilted her head slightly, not unkind, but unwavering. "That's not what I've experienced." At this point, a second figure appeared. Jeff, the tall male flight attendant who had hovered nearby during previous interactions. His face was a mask of cool control as he stepped beside Lisa, folding his arms. "Is there an issue here?" he asked, his voice low but edged. Aisha didn't flinch. "I'm asking why I've been treated differently. I've made no unreasonable requests. I've simply asked to be acknowledged with the same professionalism I've seen extended to other passengers." Jeff exchanged a look with Lisa, then turned back to Aisha, his tone taking on the careful patronization of someone trying to de-escalate without taking responsibility. We're very sorry if you feel you've been treated unfairly. If I feel. The words wrapped themselves around Aisha like barbed wire. She exhaled slowly, the breath not of anger but of control. Let's be clear, this isn't about how I feel, this is about what has happened. I was ignored, my requests were dismissed, and your apology suggests this is about perception, not behavior. The entire first-class cabin had grown quieter. Nearby passengers were now fully tuned in, though most pretended not to be. One man shifted uncomfortably in his seat, suddenly fascinated by his in-flight magazine. Another woman glanced up from her tablet and met Aisha's eyes with something that looked like shame, or maybe recognition. Lisa's jaw clenched. Jeff stood stiff, visibly uncomfortable now that the moment was out of his control. Aisha leaned back slightly, her tone soft but firm, cutting through the tension like glass. I am not looking for conflict, but I am expecting to be treated with the same respect as everyone else on this flight. I'm not asking for anything more, but I will not accept anything less. And with that, she ended it. She didn't demand a scene, she didn't yell, she didn't crumble. She simply told the truth, in the clearest voice she could. Lisa said nothing. Jeff's mouth opened, then closed again. And slowly, both attendants turned and walked away, the weight of the moment heavy behind them. Aisha sat quietly, her heartbeat steady, her breath even. She didn't need validation, but in the corner of her eye, she saw it. A man across the aisle gave her a small nod. The younger flight attendant, a woman who hadn't served her yet, walked by moments later, her eyes lingering with what looked like empathy. The cabin shifted, subtly but certainly. The storm had not come with thunder. It had come in a whisper, and still it had changed the air. To anyone listening now, to anyone watching this story unfold, you know this moment. Maybe not from the aisle of a plane, but from an office, a classroom, a conference, a dinner party, a checkout line. A moment when you knew the difference between being seen and being tolerated. This story isn't about drinks or seating charts. It's about presence, about how it feels to take up space in a room that keeps trying to erase you, and how powerful it is when you choose to stay anyway, calm, grounded, clear. If Aisha's quiet strength spoke to you, click that like button right now to show her, and every person who's ever had to speak calmly while the world tried to ignore them, that you see them. Drop a comment below to tell us your story when you stood up, not with rage, but with truth. Subscribe to this channel to hear more stories like this, because these aren't just stories. They're reminders of power, of poise, of what justice can look like when it walks in softly and still shakes the room. Aisha didn't shout. She didn't accuse. She just stood tall in her seat and reminded everyone, dignity doesn't need permission. Aisha Harris stared out the window, the clouds below calm and unbothered, a sharp contrast to the quiet storm brewing within her. Moments ago, she had calmly but firmly asked a question that deserved a real answer. Why had she been treated so differently? Why was her presence in first class met with avoidance, clipped tones, and condescension? But instead of owning their actions, Lisa and Jeff had responded with the most tired, hollow phrase of all, I'm sorry if you feel that way. Not, I'm sorry we did this. Not, you're right and we'll do better. No. It was a dismissal cloaked in politeness, a subtle way of calling her feelings an overreaction. And Aisha had felt that sting before, so many times in so many rooms. But this time, something in her refused to shrink or stay quiet. She wouldn't raise her voice. She wouldn't become the caricature they expected. But she would act. And she would do so with the strength of someone who knew exactly who she was. With calm deliberation, Aisha reached into her bag and retrieved her phone. She wasn't calling for revenge. She wasn't calling to demand someone be handled. She was calling for accountability, not just for herself, but for the countless other women who looked like her, who had been dismissed in conference rooms, classrooms, board meetings, luxury boutiques, and now airplane cabins. She scrolled through her contacts until she landed on the name she needed, Samuel Harris, her husband, her partner, her advocate. But more than that, a senior board member of this very airline, a man who had helped shape policies, who believed in integrity, who would listen not because she was his wife, but because injustice mattered to him. The call connected after 2 rings. Hey, sweetheart. Samuel said warmly, his voice soft with familiarity. You in the air already? Yes, she said, her tone composed. But the moment lingered with weight. Sam, I need your help, but not in the way you think. His voice changed instantly. What happened? Aisha explained everything, not with emotion, but with precision. She described Lisa's constant avoidance, the way Jeff had inserted himself not to listen, but to silence, and how every time she'd been skipped, every time her request had been brushed off, it had been like a whispered reminder. You don't belong here. She didn't embellish, she didn't dramatize, she just told the truth. And that truth was sharp enough. Samuel was quiet on the other end. When he finally spoke, there was steel in his voice. Say the word, and I'll handle it directly. But Aisha shook her head, even though he couldn't see her. No, Sam, I don't want to be rescued. I want to be respected. I want you to do one thing. What's that? Get in touch with Raymond Carter. Even through the phone, she could feel him sit up straighter. Raymond Carter, the CEO of the airline, a man who didn't tolerate negligence or excuses. A man who, if he heard what was happening, wouldn't let it slide under the rug. You think he'll listen? Samuel asked. I think he needs to hear it, Aisha replied. And I think he'd care, not because I'm special, but because this isn't about one flight attendant. This is about culture, about what kind of company you say you are, and what kind of company you actually are. Samuel was quiet again, then said softly, You're right, I'll call him now. They ended the call, and Aisha slid her phone back into her bag. She wasn't angry, not anymore. She was clear, and that clarity gave her a stillness that even turbulence couldn't shake. And now, to you watching, listening, and feeling this story unfold, maybe you've been there too. Maybe you've sat somewhere you earned, be it a first-class cabin, a promotion, or a classroom, and been made to feel like your presence was an error. Maybe you've been met with polite resistance instead of open respect. And maybe, just maybe, you've had to decide between letting it slide or standing up. Not with volume, but with value. Aisha chose to stand. And in doing so, she did what so many are afraid to. She refused to be dismissed. So if you felt something stir in you while hearing this, drop a comment below. Let Aisha know that you see her, that you hear her, that her strength matters. Right, I stand with Aisha. If you've ever had to speak up for yourself, when it would have been easier to let it go. Like this video, if you believe in calm courage and quiet power, the kind that doesn't shout to be heard, but is heard because it's rooted in truth. Because Aisha's story isn't just about a flight, it's about what we do when respect isn't offered freely. It's about what it means to say, I deserve better, not with anger, but with unwavering dignity. And the most powerful part? Aisha never asked to be seen as a hero. She just refused to be seen as less. So let's stand beside her now, because she didn't call you a confrontation. She called for change, and change is coming. Raymond Carter sat in seat 23C, a humble spot in the middle of the economy cabin, his frame tucked neatly between two unsuspecting passengers. A young father soothing a fussy toddler to his left, and an elderly woman flipping through a crossword puzzle on his right. Dressed casually in dark jeans and a soft gray pullover, there was nothing about his appearance that screamed power. No suit, no assistant, no fanfare. And yet, Raymond Carter was not just any passenger. He was the CEO of the airline, the very one whose name sat atop every employee badge, whose vision was etched into every training module, whose expectations, at least on paper, were rooted in respect, excellence, and equity. He flew anonymously on purpose, choosing random flights with no notice, not to catch people doing wrong, but to see who they were when no one was watching. He believed in truth without performance. But what he had witnessed today pierced deeper than he expected. It started small, so small in fact, that most passengers wouldn't have noticed. But Raymond noticed at everything. That was his job, his instinct, his integrity. He had seen her board first. Aisha Harris, poised, graceful, business ready. She had walked down the jet bridge like she had every right to be there, and she did. But the moment she stepped aboard, Raymond saw it in the attendant's body language. The forced smile, the narrowed eyes, the small flick of her gaze to the first-class section as if questioning the ticket in Aisha's hand. Then through the narrow slit between the curtains separating first class and coach, Raymond watched, row after row, glass after glass, smiles given freely to every passenger except her. At first, he thought he might be reading into it, but then came the second moment, the ignored drink service, the delayed meal, the lack of eye contact, the too tight napkin, the deliberate chill in their voices. He saw it all, the microaggressions most people pretend not to see. But Raymond couldn't pretend. Not when every training, every brand promise, every leadership speech he'd ever given insisted that his airline was better than this. And still, there it was, unfolding in real time, not during a complaint email or customer survey, but right in front of him. And then came the voice he knew well. His personal phone tucked deep into his coat pocket, buzzed gently against his side. He pulled it out discreetly and read the caller ID. Samuel Harris. Raymond's eyebrows lifted. Samuel wasn't just a respected board member. He was a man whose judgment Raymond trusted, a man whose values matched his own. Raymond answered in a low voice, his words barely above a whisper. Samuel? Raymond, came the voice on the other end, tight with a concern. My wife is on your flight. Raymond turned his head slightly, as if something in the air had suddenly aligned. 2A, Samuel continued. Aisha Harris, there's a problem. Raymond's stomach dropped. He'd already seen the problem. He had watched it play out from behind the curtain of class and false professionalism. But now it had a name, a connection, a face. I've seen it, Raymond said quietly. I'm watching it unfold. There was a pause. Then I don't need to tell you what to do, Samuel replied, his voice calm but tight with emotion. No, Raymond said. You don't. They hung up without another word. Come on. Raymond sat still for a moment, the weight of everything pressing against him, not just as a CEO, but as a man who understood what it meant to promise safety and respect, only to see that promise broken in the most subtle, insidious way. He thought of Aisha, of how she had sat still, elegant, composed, how she had waited, spoken calmly, stood her ground without fire, but with steel. He felt something like shame crawl across his skin, not because of what he had done, but because of what had happened on his watch. And in that moment, something hardened inside him. Not anger, not vengeance, resolve. The time for watching was over. Now he would act. And to you listening, yes, you hearing this story unfold, have you ever been in a room where you were dismissed in silence? Have you ever witnessed injustice but stayed quiet, unsure if it was your place to speak? Have you ever seen someone endure something that made your stomach turn, not because it was loud, but because it was so heartbreakingly quiet? This is that moment. This is the turning point. So if this moment moved you, if you felt what Raymond felt, sitting there in 23C, knowing something was deeply wrong, leave a comment below. Tell us what you would do in his shoes. Tell us if you've been Aisha or if you've seen her. Write I see her if you believe in holding systems accountable, not just people. Like this story, if you believe quiet injustice is still injustice and deserves to be met with bold truth. Because sometimes the most powerful man on the plane isn't the one in the cockpit. He's in economy, watching, waiting, and ready to make it right. Raymond Carter stood near the galley, the hum of the engines a low growl behind him, his presence understated but unmistakable. He wasn't wearing a uniform. He didn't carry a clipboard. But something in the way he stood, still, commanding and deeply present, shifted the energy in the cabin the moment he stepped forward. One by one, heads began to turn. Not because they knew who he was, but because they could feel something had changed. Quiet had given way to consequence. The CEO of the airline, who had spent the last 3 hours bearing silent witness from seat 23C, now moved with purpose. He had watched the entire chain of events, the subtle mistreatment, the clipped tones, the absence of warmth that every other first-class passenger had been gifted but withheld from Aisha Harris. He had felt his stomach twist each time she was overlooked, each time her quiet dignity was met with calculated disregard. But watching wasn't enough anymore. Now it was time to act. He approached the senior flight attendant with calm precision and spoke just loud enough for Lisa and Jeff, still whispering near the galley, to hear. Please inform the crew that I need to speak with the two of you, he said, looking directly at Lisa. Her face froze. The shift in her posture was immediate. Her shoulders stiffening, a recognition dawned. She turned pale, her mouth parting slightly in disbelief. Jeff straightened as well, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his brow. The air between them changed in an instant, no longer one of control but of reckoning. Lisa and Jeff followed Raymond into the galley without a word. The silence between them was thick with tension. When they arrived, Raymond stood firm, his eyes not angry but unwavering. He gestured for them to stand aside while he tapped his earpiece. "Miss Harris," he said gently into the cabin intercom, "if you're comfortable, I'd like to speak with you privately for a moment." Aisha turned, startled at the unexpected voice over the system. Heads turned with her, passengers now clearly realizing something significant was unfolding. Still poised, she rose from her seat, her footsteps soft but steady as she made her way toward the galley. She was calm, but everyone watching knew this was no ordinary passenger. She carried herself like someone who had walked through fire and refused to burn. When she entered the small galley, Raymond stepped forward, offering her a seat on the fold-down jump seat. "Thank you for joining me," he said. "Please sit." Aisha sat, her gaze steady. "You know who I am?" Raymond gave a faint nod. "Yes, I know exactly who you are, and more importantly, I know what you've experienced today." He glanced toward Lisa and Jeff, who stood stiffly near the galley door, then turned back to Aisha. "I was in 23C, he said simply. Aisha blinked. "You were watching?" "I was observing," Raymond corrected gently. "That's what I do on these flights, incognito. It helps me see what truly happens when no one's performing." A pause stretched between them, charged with truth. "What I saw," he continued, his voice low but resolute, "was unacceptable. And I want to hear it from your perspective, because your voice matters more than what I saw. Tell me what happened, and I will listen." Aisha's shoulders eased just slightly, surprised, but cautiously hopeful. She recounted her experience, the subtle brush-offs, the deliberate lack of attention, the difference in tone. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't accuse. She just laid out the facts, one after another, each sentence like a quiet arrow landing exactly where it was meant to. When she finished, she looked Raymond square in the eye. "I've worked too hard, climbed too far, and stayed too silent for too long to let this pass. Not for me, but for the next person they dismiss." Raymond inhaled deeply, the weight of her words settling into his chest. "Thank you," he said simply, "for speaking up, for staying composed, for refusing to be erased." Then he turned toward Lisa and Jeff, his expression shifting. "You failed this passenger," he said, his voice calm but cutting. "You failed this company. You failed every value we claim to represent." Lisa opened her mouth to speak, her voice small. "I didn't mean—" Raymond raised a hand. "It's not about what you meant. It's about what you did. Intentions don't erase impact." Jeff remained silent, his face hard to read. Raymond continued. "I've built this airline on the principle that every passenger, regardless of gender, skin color, seat number, or background, deserves the same respect. And today I saw that principle broken, repeatedly. A moment passed, heavy with consequence. Effective immediately," he said, "you are both relieved of duty." Lisa gasped. "Please, sir." "This is not punishment," Raymond cut in. "This is accountability." Aisha sat silently, her fingers laced in her lap. She didn't cheer, she didn't gloat, because this wasn't about vengeance. It was about justice, the kind that came not with volume, but with truth. Raymond turned to her again. "Miss Harris," he said, his voice softer, "you deserved better. And I will ensure that what happened here is not buried, but used as the catalyst for real change. Not just training, culture, oversight, listening, really listening, because dignity is not optional. It's a right." Aisha nodded slowly. "Then let this be the last time someone in my seat has to prove they belong in it." Raymond's eyes held hers for a long moment. "It will be. And now, to everyone listening, really listening, what would you have done in Aisha's shoes? Would you have stayed quiet to keep the peace? Would you have questioned whether it was really happening? Or would you have done what Aisha did, stand up, not by shouting, but by showing up with power in your voice and stillness in your soul? If Aisha's grace moved you, comment below and tell her so. Let her know you see her, you believe her, and you're better because of her story. Right? I believe in accountability. If you know we need more leaders like Raymond and more courage like Aisha, like this story to lift up the quiet warriors who choose dignity over drama and justice over silence. Because today, in the sky, leadership didn't come from the cockpit. It came from 2A, and it changed everything. Raymond Carter stood silently for a moment, his arms crossed over his chest, as the hum of the aircraft filled the tight galley like a pulse. The door to the cockpit was just behind him. The curtain to first class hung just beside him. But right now, the only thing that mattered was the truth standing in front of him. Aisha Harris, seated on the fold-down jump seat, calm, quiet, and composed even in the wake of repeated disrespect. The two people who had orchestrated that disrespect, Lisa and Jeff, stood stiffly across from her, their uniforms crisp but their dignity unraveling thread by thread. Raymond's jaw tightened, not with rage but with the weight of deep disappointment. He had watched this play out from seat 23C with quiet fury, watched Aisha be ignored, watched her polite request deflected, watched her treated like an afterthought by the very employees meant to serve with professionalism and grace. And now, standing face to face, Raymond wasn't going to let it end with a soft apology or a written warning. No, some moments demand more. Let's begin with honesty, Raymond said, his voice low but unwavering. Tell me, do either of you honestly believe that what Miss Harris experienced today meets our standard of service? Lisa shifted, her eyes darting toward Jeff, who stood frozen, arms folded in silent defense. I didn't mean to offend her, Lisa mumbled. It wasn't intentional. That's not what I asked, Raymond said, his eyes narrowing. Was it acceptable? Lisa swallowed hard. No, she whispered. It wasn't. Raymond turned to Jeff. And you? Jeff's jaw clenched. It wasn't personal, he replied stiffly. She was upset. I stepped in to keep the situation from escalating. Aisha's brows rose slightly, but she said nothing. The words hung there, stale and familiar, another attempt to paint her as the problem. The narrative that had followed women like her for centuries, composed but difficult, firm but aggressive, aware but overreacting. Raymond's gaze sharpened. She wasn't upset, he said flatly. She was dismissed, she was ignored, she was undervalued. And when she voiced it with grace, you made it about her reaction instead of your behavior. The silence that followed wasn't awkward, it was devastating. Lisa looked away, shame rising in her cheeks. Jeff folded his arms tighter. Raymond stepped forward now, just slightly, not with anger but with certainty. I want to be clear, he said. This isn't about a glass of water or a missing smile. It's about the accumulation of small choices that became a statement. And the statement I saw from both of you was this: you don't belong here. Aisha sat still, her eyes glassy but unflinching. She didn't need to speak. She didn't need to argue. The truth had finally been spoken for her. Lisa tried one last time. I really didn't mean for it to go this far. It went this far, Raymond interrupted, because neither of you stopped it. In fact, you perpetuated it. You both had multiple opportunities to reset, to reflect, to course correct, and instead you doubled down. Then came the moment that would change everything. Effective immediately, Raymond said, his tone like steel wrapped in velvet. You are relieved of duty, both of you. Lisa gasped. Sir, please. This isn't a punishment, he said calmly. This is accountability. We don't get to apologize only when we're caught. We don't get to treat passengers like burdens and call it miscommunication. We lead with respect, or we don't lead at all. Jeff said nothing, but his face crumbled. Aisha closed her eyes just for a moment, not in triumph, but in quiet release. A breath she had been holding for the entire flight finally exhaled. She hadn't wanted retribution, but she had wanted the truth to be seen, named, and addressed. And now, for the first time all day, she felt seen. Raymond turned back to her. Miss Harris, he said gently, on behalf of this airline, I want to thank you. You handled yourself with dignity, strength, and clarity. Your presence on this flight was not only earned, but essential. I've learned from watching you today, and I'll make sure others learn too. Aisha nodded slowly, her voice soft. I didn't speak up just for me, she said. I did it for the next woman who walks on board and gets looked through, For the next passenger who's told their experience is just a feeling. I don't want silence to be the cost of grace anymore. Raymond's chest tightened. Neither do I. But it didn't stop there. After the flight landed, Raymond didn't disappear into an executive suite or send a follow-up email to PR. He called an immediate meeting with his senior leadership team, not the next day, not next quarter, that same night. The topic? Systemic accountability. He ordered a full internal review of crew behavior logs. He expanded bias and sensitivity training, making it not just required but monitored with anonymous passenger feedback. He introduced a first-of-its-kind initiative, a hotline where any passenger, regardless of status, could report subtle discrimination or professionalism concerns directly to the executive office, bypassing the usual customer service maze. He created a recurring program called From the Cabin, where airline leaders flew once a month in coach, business, and first class unannounced, just to observe. And at the heart of it all, he named the program after the moment that changed him, the Harris Standard. It was more than a name, it was a promise. And to you listening, if Aisha's strength spoke to you, if you've ever sat silently through moments that made you shrink, if you've ever felt like you were being measured, not by your worth, but by someone else's bias, this story is for you. Comment below, I believe in the Harris Standard. Show the world that grace is power, that truth is leadership, and that respect should never be optional. Stand with Aisha by sharing your story, even if your voice shakes. Like this story to honor every person who ever chose dignity over silence. Because today, Aisha didn't just change a flight, she changed a company. And maybe she'll change us too. Back at the airline's global headquarters, far from the hum of the engines and the narrow aisles of Flight 417, something was shifting, something permanent. The events of that flight had not been swept away by landing gear and routine. They had taken root. And at the heart of that change stood one woman who never raised her voice, never demanded the spotlight, but whose quiet strength reshaped an entire institution. Aisha Harris, once just another first-class passenger on a routine flight, was now the symbol of a reckoning the airline could no longer postpone. And Raymond Carter, CEO and lifelong architect of the company's brand, was the one making sure her name would not be forgotten. He stood before his senior leadership team, 30 executives in a glass-paneled conference room overlooking a skyline clouded by the remnants of a passing storm, and he did what few in his position ever do. He admitted they had failed. "Let me be clear," Raymond said, his voice firm, his jaw tight with conviction. "This company, our company, has built its reputation on safety, service, and professionalism. But none of that matters if we fail to deliver the most basic human promise: respect." What happened to Ms. Harris aboard that flight was not a one-off. It was the culmination of hundreds of unchecked moments, small, silent, and invisible to those who never have to endure them. But not anymore. The silence ends now. The room was still. Some leaders averted their eyes. Others leaned forward, their expressions tight with discomfort. Because when a system is challenged, it resists. But Raymond wasn't interested in resistance. He was interested in transformation. He walked to the whiteboard behind him and wrote 2 words in bold capital letters: the Harris Standard. "This isn't a PR campaign," he said, turning back to the room. "It's a new blueprint." And then, like a stone thrown into still water, the ripples began. Effective immediately, the company launched Project Elevate, a sweeping internal initiative aimed at embedding equity, empathy, and accountability into every layer of the organization. Gone were the outdated training videos and generic scripts. In their place, Leaf interactive equity labs were introduced, sessions led by a diverse team of instructors, many of whom had lived experience with bias, exclusion, and resilience. Every flight crew, customer service agent, and executive, regardless of rank, would be required to attend, not once but quarterly. Participation wasn't tracked with checkboxes. It was measured by anonymous feedback from both peers and passengers. And the system made one promise above all: if a guest on any flight felt unsafe, unheard, or disrespected, they would be believed. Raymond also instituted a confidential digital platform named Vocal, where employees and passengers could report bias, microaggressions, or professional misconduct without fear of retaliation. Each report would be reviewed not by middle management, but by an independent equity review board composed of internal leaders and external advocates. Transparency was no longer optional. It was policy. And perhaps the most significant change of all, every new hire, from baggage handlers to pilots, would be introduced not with corporate slogans, but with Aisha's story. A calm, deliberate voiceover would tell the truth of what happened on Flight 417, not to shame, but to educate. This company is not perfect, the narrator would say, but we are committed to learning. Because of one passenger's courage, we are better. Aisha herself was invited to join the Advisory Council on Equity and Culture. At first, she hesitated. She had not spoken up to be turned into a symbol. She didn't want to be tokenized or made into a brand. But after Raymond met with her, face to face, no titles, no power plays, she agreed, on one condition. "This isn't about putting my name on a building," she said. "It's about making sure that no other woman like me, no other person like me, has to sit in a premium seat and be made to feel like they don't belong." And Raymond understood. And now, to you, the one listening, whether you've ever spoken up in a quiet room or stayed silent because the weight felt too heavy, this is your moment too. Drop a comment below and tell Aisha what her strength means to you. Let her know that grace isn't weakness, it's power in its purest form. Like this story, if you've ever needed to be reminded that standing tall doesn't require shouting, and that dignity doesn't ask for permission, type "I believe in the Harris standard" if you know that real change begins not in boardrooms, but in bravery. Because this isn't just a story about an airline. It's about the ripple effect of one woman's refusal to be dismissed. It's about how justice isn't always loud, but it is relentless. It's about how Aisha, without ever needing a spotlight, lit the way for hundreds who had been walking in quiet darkness. And it's a reminder that the smallest moment, a missed smile, a wrong tone, a silent dismissal, can become the spark that burns down complacency and builds something far better in its place. So next time you see someone who doesn't raise their voice, but refuses to be ignored, remember this flight, remember this woman, and remember, her courage changed everything. The wheels touched down with a soft rumble, and just like that, the flight was over. But for Aisha Harris, what had happened in the sky wasn't simply a chapter closed, it was a door opened. As the plane taxied toward the gate, the golden evening light streamed through the cabin windows, casting soft shadows across the faces of passengers still processing the events of the flight. A few offered Aisha quiet nods, hushed thank yous, or respectful glances. She didn't bask in it. She didn't need applause. She simply gathered her things, adjusted her blazer, and stood tall. When she stepped into the terminal, the cool air hit her face with a crispness that felt like something more than temperature. It felt like clarity. She paused for just a moment near the window, watching as baggage carts rolled beneath the aircraft's wing, and she smiled. Not because everything was fixed, not because the world had suddenly become just, but because she knew without a doubt that she had done something that mattered. She had walked on that plane expecting only a quiet flight and time to prepare for a meeting. She had carried nothing but her presence, her poise, and her patience. But when confronted with quiet indignity, dismissal that wore the mask of professionalism, she had made a choice, not to retaliate, but to respond. Not with fury, but with firmness. Not with noise, but with clarity. And from that stillness, a storm of transformation had begun. As Aisha exited the terminal and stepped into the warm embrace of dusk, her phone buzzed in her bag. It was a message from Raymond Carter. "Thank you again for your strength. The Harris Standard is live. You inspired us more than you know." A deep breath settled in her chest. She looked up at the sky, painted in soft hues of violet and gold, and for the first time in a long while, she felt the weight lift. Not because the burden was gone, but because she had decided she no longer had to carry it alone. And here's the part you need to hear. Yes, you, listening right now, maybe you've never boarded a plane and been ignored. Maybe you've never had your humanity questioned in silence. But maybe you have. Maybe you've been in a classroom or a conference room or a grocery aisle or even your own home and felt the slow sting of being unseen. Maybe you've swallowed your words, lowered your voice, bit your tongue just to keep the peace. And maybe, like Aisha, you've wondered, is it even worth it to speak? Let this story be your answer. Yes, it is. Because you never know who's watching. You never know whose heart is ready to change. You never know when your quiet strength will echo into something bigger than you. Aisha didn't scream. She didn't curse. She didn't shame. She showed up, composed, articulate, and grounded. And because she did, an entire airline took notice. A CEO watched and acted. Policies changed. Culture shifted. And thousands of future passengers, people who will never even know her name, will be treated with more care, more fairness, more dignity because one woman refused to shrink. And that, dear listener, is the power of a moment. That's the power of one voice. That's the power of you. So if Aisha's story touched you, if you felt her grace, her courage, her resiliency, drop a comment below. Let Aisha know that her strength rippled outward, that it wasn't in vain, that she made you stand taller. Hit that like button to show her that calm courage is worth celebrating. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss a story like this. Stories that center not just on drama, but on dignity. Stories that remind us of who we are when it matters most. And if you've ever been made to feel small, remember this. You are not your silence. You are not their assumptions. You are not where they try to place you. You are who you choose to be in that moment when someone tells you, by action or by tone, that you don't belong. And your response? Let it be like Aisha's. Measured, strong, unapologetically clear. Because change doesn't always come with volume. Sometimes it comes with stillness, with truth, with a woman standing alone in row 2A, looking someone in the eye and saying, I deserve to be here, and meaning every word of it.